Welcome to the second installment of our series on the origin and development of Southern Appalachian or Scotch-Irish English. I was happy that the first video was well received, but I want to address a thoughtful comment sent in by a viewer from Northumbria, that's over in England on the border. In the first video I mentioned that the dialect of Wessex was the first standardized form of English. That statement needs some further clarification. The Wessex dialect was indeed the first form of English to be used by a lone Anglo-Saxon government in England, which is what I was thinking about last week. But the literary standardization of English would come shortly after the rise of two little universities at Oxford and Cambridge. By the 15th to 16th centuries, scholars and government officials had adopted the dialect spoken in the East Midlands and London, so it became the first standardized form of literary English in Great Britain. Just wanted to clarify that. You might be interested to know that the average person in Great Britain and Ireland didn't always speak a Germanic language. Nope, they sure didn't. In the Highlands in Ireland and the Inner and Outer Hebrides, people spoke Gaelic, to the disgust of King James himself. There were other languages spoken in Great Britain too, as late as the 12th century. Cumbric, it's a language similar to Old Welsh, was spoken in Strathclyde, that's down in the southwestern corner of Scotland, across the Irish Sea from Ulster, Northern Ireland. And by 1300, a form of English was spoken throughout much of the lowlands. Scottish lowlanders borrowed from the tongue of the Angles, who had established the kingdom of Northumbria that stretched from Edinburgh, Scotland, throughout the border country and much of northern England, a place called Northumbria. In the Bonny Land, their dialect of English was called Scots. Over in England, it was called Northumbrian. On today's show, I want to pick up where we left off last week and fill in some gaps by visiting the Isles during the time of the Celts, Romans, and Anglo-Saxons. I hope you'll join me. I realize that what I'm about to say is controversial in some circles, but the indigenous British people in Great Britain and Ireland were Celtic speakers called the Bell Beakers. They brought Celtic languages with them from the continent. Genetic studies show that a good percentage of British DNA was replaced by the Bell Beakers, but in the absence of a name for all the tribes that lived there, I'll use Celtic for them, and that includes the Picts, or the painted people. That's what the Romans called them. There's a good reason for considering all pre-Roman islanders as Celts, since it was not a racial categorization. Rather, it was based on material culture and language. Still, scientists from the University of Aberdeen, Stockholm University, and Liverpool John Moores University teamed up to determine the genetic relationships between the Picts and neighboring modern-day and ancient populations. Their results show that individuals from southwestern and western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria display a higher degree of identity by descent, IBD, sharing with the Pictish genomes. That means that they are genetically the most similar among modern populations to the ancient Picts, yet no one knows how their language sounded. You should note that the genetic makeup was distinct from areas in England south of, let's say, in southern England, let's just put it that way, where there was a greater relative degree of Anglo-Saxon heritage. So a lot more DNA from the Anglo-Saxons, Frisians, and Jutes down in the southern part of England, and eastern part too for that matter. With the genetic stuff out of the way, let's get back to language. By the time of Julius Caesar, islanders spoke either Guadelic or Gaelic or a Brythonic language. Only about a dozen Brythonic language words made it into modern English, and relatively few Gaelic words are found in the language. Names, however, are a different story. They are better represented among the populations from the Isles than one might believe. The Romans and Germans did a stunning job of stripping the indigenous people of their tongues. The Romans. Although most Americans of normal intelligence are familiar with the Romans, they may not know that their own culture, including their language, was influenced by them. That's right. In around 54 BC, Julius Caesar attempted an invasion of Great Britain, but he backed off. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius resumed Julius's conquest. He quickly dominated the tribes of southeastern England. In short order, the Romans had decided not to invade Ireland. They considered the Emerald Isle to be too cold to inhabit, so they called it Hibernia, the land of winter. By 122 AD, they had decided that Scotland was not worth the effort that it would take to pacify the Picts and the Brigantes. Most of the names that we consider to be Celtic names were in fact assigned to them by the Romans. For example, even words like Picts, Britannia, Caledonia, Scotty, and among many others. They all came from the Romans. The Britons in the south of what would later be called England were for the most part assimilated into the culture of the Romans. The Romans found the climate and terrain of southern Britain to be well suited to cultivation. There were navigable rivers and excellent harbors in the south. As a consequence, the Romans focused their attention on resources of that region. In hilly areas with mineral springs, the Romans built baths as resorts for their soldiers. In other words, the Romans developed roads and communication infrastructure so well that the folks in southern Great Britain acquired a bit of savoir-faire or confidence over their more barbarous neighbors to the north and west. One such resort became the center of the city of Bath, or Bath, if you're around these parts, in southeastern England, Somerset County. Now, to get resources to Rome, the empire built networks of roads that connected its island holdings to London. The city of London was built by Roman engineers and it served as their capital in Britain, then known as Britannia. Ships loaded with resources from the island set sail for Rome from London's newly constructed docks. The Romans recruited Celts into their military ranks through either coercion or voluntary service. They had to because the Italian population had too few males to maintain a large and widely dispersed army. After all, the Roman Empire extended from Scotland in the northwest to Palestine in the southeast and then across North Africa. Most of the soldiers who served in the British legions, especially in the north country of Europe, were Romanized Celts, with many coming from continental locations. As the Romans advanced into northern Britain, they found increasing resistance from the Pictish and Romanized Celtic inhabitants, including the Brigantes, a tribe whose name was given to them by the Romans. Incidentally, the Brigantes were followers of the Celtic goddess Brigitte, goddess of poetry and ironworking, I believe. And later on, the Catholic Church will make Brigitte a saint in the Catholic Church. To control the traffic of Brigantes and the Picts, Emperor Hadrian opened a wall across the isthmus of northern Great Britain in 122 AD. South of Hadrian's Wall, the Romans built forts to garrison troops, so they were the vanguard against Pictish excursions into the south. Under Constantine the Great, 306 to 337 AD, he reigned that time, Rome allowed Christianity to flourish, and in 380 Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. At the end of the day, one of the most powerful contributions made by the Romans to our speech were Latin and Greek-based words and names that were prominent in the Bible. By stressing the importance of the Bible, even Greek names like Nicholas were introduced into the Isles. We can thank the Romans for theological words like gratia, or grace, scriptura, scripture, and fide, or faith. Here are some non-biblical words that made it into English from Latin. Triumph, ovation, consul, dictator, forum, circus, patrician, and decimate. Ugh, decimate. Anyway, now let's take a little bit of time and talk about the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes and Frisians. As the Roman Empire approached its demise in the west around 450 AD, legions began to withdraw from Great Britain. Hordes of Saxons invaded southern and eastern parts of the island upon invitations from Vortigern, a Celtic chieftain of some sort, while Angles and Jutes from Juteland advanced to the areas to the north and southeast of London. The Celtic inhabitants were either killed, enslaved, or intermarried with the Germanic invaders or newcomers. DNA studies have shown that the Saxons, Angles, Frisians, and Jutes contributed most of their DNA in the east and southeastern regions of England, which we mentioned a few minutes ago, and just like the older history books tell us. In addition to Wessex, the home of Alfred the Great, other groups of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes formed kingdoms in Great Britain south of what is today the eastern central belt of Scotland. By the middle of the 17th century, those invaders had formed kingdoms that included Bernicia, Deira, the East Saxon Kingdom or Essex, East Anglia, Kent, the South Saxons or Sussex, and the West Saxons or Wessex. Each of those kingdoms produced their own forms of written and spoken English. Those dialect patterns are still detectable in modern Scotland and England today. As we mentioned in episode 1, most Americans of Scots-Irish ancestry originated in southwestern Scotland, the Scottish lowlands, and the border region of England. That area of England and southeastern Scotland were united for more than 3 centuries as integral parts of the West Germanic kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira, which later unified to form an enlarged Northumbria, which was already in existence. Those kingdoms were established by the Angles from Jutland, that's the Jutland Peninsula in Scandinavia, basically what's today northern Denmark, during the Germanic invasions that began in the middle of the 5th century AD. On the heels of the Viking invasions at the end of the 8th century, unification had left only 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in what is today England. They were East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. Did you know that you may have had, or may have, Bernician, Darien, or Mercian ancestry? That's pretty cool. In our next episode, we'll show how the Viking and Norman settlers shaped dialect regions in Great Britain. We'll look at some of the words and expressions that make those dialect regions in Great Britain and Ireland so interesting to us. We will then be in a great position to appreciate how the dialects came together and functioned in the backcountry of Appalachia. Until I see you again, may the good Lord bless and keep you. Bye-bye.